For 10 years now, this has been the moment that Knowlton or I have handed over to Barbara. We won't be doing that anymore, and that's going to be awfully difficult. Barbara was more than just a colleague, more than just a friend. She was an inspiration, and we will never forget. I'm Peter Mansbridge. Now the Journal.
Good evening. My name is Mark Starovich, and I'm the producer of the Journal. Eminent people from across the nation have paid tribute to Barbara Frum today. Tonight, we who worked with her in this newsroom, producers, cameramen, editors, we want to share the stories and the memories of a woman we loved. She was a very warm person, just as likely to bring you a sandwich if you hadn't had supper, close to everyone's personal lives, always knowing when anyone's kid was sick. This gracious lady was no star. She was Barbara. Barbara, hurry up, we have an interview. Barbara, read that again, you sound flat. Barbara, here's a stack of research for tomorrow. Together, all of us here lived through incredible pressures and long, long nights. We are her other family, and we'd like to share some of those warm moments with you. Turbulent times, but times that brought stories of laughter, too.
10 years ago, when the Journal started, was the first time I met Barbara. She came into the office to sign the contract, and Mark was elated. He was running up and down the aisles telling everybody that Barbara Frum was coming, that we'd got her signed, that she's going to do the Journal. This incredibly powerful, brilliant woman was now coming into the office, and I was actually rather nervous, rather scared. In walks this woman who is wearing the most outrageous dress, flowered nylons, and these yellow polka dot shoes. And all I could think of was how incredibly diversified she must be.
Dr. Wake, is there any pattern here? Do frogs always tell you something?
Well, it was my first briefing with Barbara, and it was on frogs. And I was going to the studio. I was a nervous wreck. I was shaking. I hadn't slept all night. And when I came in, she says, oh, come on, sit down. Moved all her newspapers, bags. I sat down, and when I turned around, she was changing her clothes. And here was this lady who I respected and admired, and she was half naked standing in front of me. Well, I don't know, I couldn't say a thing, and all she wanted to know was why there was a decline in the frog population in the world.
For the past couple of years, part of my job was to phone Barbara Frum every morning to discuss the lineup of the program that night and who we were going to interview. And many of those calls lasted more than an hour, and many of those days I was very tired from the night before and just wanting to get tonight's show on the air. And I'd tell her what the type of people we're thinking of interviewing and the line of questioning, and she'd say, Doug, that's not good enough. You know, don't you realize what the story is here? Haven't you read the New York Times editorial, the piece in Harper's? We just can't interview those people. We have to have this element and that element. And the power of this curiosity and intellect just made me feel guilty sometimes that I was trying to do things in an easy way. And over the years, working with Barbara has been exhausting and exhilarating, and I'm really going to miss the roller coaster ride.
How finally bitter are you that you were the guy they were ready to throw over the side? You can't imagine how many women have said they don't like you, and why am I coming down here to talk to you?
I know.
And one woman even said, don't let him rape you, intellectually, I mean.
And we sat for about 2 hours discussing the implications of the story and the issues and the focus. And when I left, I thought, wow, you know, this was Barbara Frum talking to, you know, a woman that had had decades of experience in journalism, talking to me who had had only a couple of years. But that was Barbara Frum. She never made you feel as though your opinions were any less valuable than her own.
And I think that says everything about Barbara Frum. She was like your elder sister. She was wiser, and you always thought that she was going to be around.
I often wish that people could see this side of Barbara. She cared about people she didn't even know.
Karina, whenever anything horrible like this happens and television calls up on people like you and everyone says, oh, you didn't ask her the right thing, she wants to say something and you didn't ask the right question, I just wish I could be quiet and you could just say what this means.
During the war in the Gulf,
when she came into this room daily, asking about my family who's living back in the Middle East. And on one occasion, she took my hand, she held it, and then I felt that she's shaking. And I said to her, Barbara, it's okay. It will be over.
Yeah, I was working at the Journal about a year and a half when CUPE went on strike, the union I'm in. And one day in the picket line, Barbara came up to cross the line, and she saw I was there and called me over. And she took me aside and said to me, she just said, if anyone has a problem with money because of the union or whatever, to let her know, not let the union know or anybody else, just come to her, and she would help this person financially if she could, as long as it remained anonymous.
I was on the road with Jean-Guy No, our cameraman, who had a terrible accident and was very badly hurt. And a couple of nights later, I was back in Halifax, and I got one of those famous late-night phone calls from Barbara. And she talked for about an hour about what we could do to help Guy. And as she continued to talk, I kept looking at my watch because I knew it was getting closer and closer to airtime, that she had to do the show that night. And as I worried that she wouldn't make it, she just continued to worry about what we could do to help Guy.
Barbara Frum knew about having fun, about living life, and about, above all, about not taking herself too seriously. And if you want to understand what Barbara was really, really like, for those of us who worked with her, take a look at the tape of her with Greg Malone at the Gemini Awards.
You agree to come here tonight to present an award? You come here and there's a bogus Barbara, a phony Frum here in your place. Are you bitter?
She came in the evening just before her show, and she introduced herself, and she had a bottle of hairspray and a plastic fork in her hands, and she says, I was wondering if you could help me with my hair, it's fallen a bit. So I said, sure, no problem. So she gives me the hairspray, and she takes the plastic fork, goes to the mirror and lifts her hair with the plastic fork and says, oh, could you spray here? So I sprayed it, and we did her entire hair like that.
One night we had some technical difficulties for the show, and it was a rough show. And everyone's feeling kind of down afterwards. And we'd finished, and I turned around, and Barbara comes through the control room door, looks me in the eye and says, well, at least the hair looked good.
What was the movie that was playing in your head during those 4 minutes? People watching you were so nervous. They wanted you to win so badly. What was happening inside between your ears?
When I first joined the Journal as a producer, everybody warned me, look, when you go in to brief Barbara Frum, make sure that you're really well prepared because she asks really tough questions. And so the first interview I booked was with Brian Orser, the skater, and I studied all night on what's a double toe loop and a triple axel, and I went in with a stack of notes ready for anything. She looked up at me and she said, look, the only thing I want to know is how tall is Brian Orser? Of course, I didn't have a clue, and I was thrown into a total panic.
Last year, I was working with Barbara on a story about the government's new gun control bill, and she was asking me about the kind of guns that would be included under the bill, and then she started asking me about pellet guns, you know, kids' little pellet guns, and I started thinking, well, I don't think pellet guns would be included under the gun control bill. I don't think that's what the federal government had in mind. And then she started talking about squirrels and pellet guns, and whether I thought a pellet gun could wound a squirrel. And I was completely lost in the conversation. And it turned out that, unbeknownst to me, she'd switched topics. And she wasn't talking about the gun control bill anymore. She was talking about squirrels and her bird feeders, and she'd been planning on buying a pellet gun, sitting in the back porch, and picking them off from a rocking chair. And I told her that image might not go over well with her adoring public.
When I first came to Canada at the beginning of the 80s, that's how I learned about the country. I watched the Journal and I listened to As It Happens, and the Journal for me was Barbara Frum.
I want to know
basic question, yeah.
If you and Mr. Trudeau mesmerized us with this nationalism issue for 15 or 20 years, took our eye off our real needs as a nation. Do you feel you distracted us onto the wrong topic? Look at the trouble we're in now.
No, I don't think so, because one way or another it had to be dealt with.
I have no grief with Mr. Bourassa. or with Mr. Giz, they're trying to get more power.
No, but
for
I'm
the
sorry.
province.
What I asked you is, would you leave Quebec out long term?
It's not out, Barbara. Don't use that silly word that's
Would you
used on
leave
the
them
CBC all the time.
unreconciled? Would you leave them unreconciled?
Mr. Peckford's unreconciled.
People will say you're giving up. You're giving up on Canada. They're saying, we didn't give up. Premier Bourassa is giving up on behalf of Quebec. That's what they'll say.
I fought and I fought and I fought.
The thing that always impressed me about Barbara was her keen interest in every story, even stories that the rest of us would sometimes get bored with. I remember we were covering a Premier's conference once, and all day we'd been watching this endless parade of political speeches, and I went over to Barbara's dressing room to have a chat with her, and she looked up from the monitor where she was also watching the speeches and said, "It's like popcorn. It's like having popcorn, isn't it? Once you start, you just can't get enough."
A couple of years ago when Barbara went on holiday, she ended up in Europe and she decided she wanted to take a side trip to Romania. This was before everything had happened, and she just felt that things were happening in Romania. She wanted to be there. And I remember taking a phone call at the desk and they said, "Is Barbara Frum calling?" Well, Barbara wasn't working. She was on holiday. So I said, "Hi, what's going on?" She says, "I'm standing on the balcony of my hotel and I can see these riots and demonstrations and I'd really like to talk about it on the show, and I've got a crew all lined up." She knew exactly what she needed. Of course, as things go, we didn't have room for her on the show that night, and it was really a pity because, of course, she had much of the story before the world did.
The first thing I did when I got in this morning was I went into our basement and brought up boxes of tapes from November '89 when we did 3 shows from the Soviet Union. And I remembered how excited Barbara was to be there. It was just like a kid. And the one thing I remember is the final on camera with Peter Mansbridge and Barbara and Red Square with the snow and St. Basil's in the background.
In some ways, I will confess I'm envious of our colleagues who get to stay behind now because they are going to watch history being made. This used to be a hardship post. Now it's the most coveted one in the whole world.
We had an interview with Boris Yeltsin, and while myself and the rest of the crew were trying to iron out all the technical details, Boris Yeltsin became a little testy with Barbara and said, "The time of a minister is very important." And Barbara shot back, "Well, our time is very important too."
I simply don't know how to deal with you. Why? Because you arrive in our studio, you are as natural and adorable as you've always been in all your films. And yet you've got all kinds of other things that you want to say about your life experiences, and I don't know how to deal with that, the spiritual side. I just see you here and you're just a normal person.
That was just a joke, bringing the broads, right? But God, it must have been wild.
Yeah, it was wild. Sure. Next question. She wants to draw me on this. How wild? And just what form did this wild take?
I remember one occasion several years ago in the early days of the program, traveling to Ottawa with Barbara to interview then Prime Minister Trudeau. After the end of a very intense interview with the Prime Minister, Barbara sought her trademark, "Thank you for this," to which the Prime Minister did not respond. She tried again, "Thank you for this." Stone-faced, he did not respond. She said, "Look, if you could just help us with this, we could wrap up the interview." "Prime Minister, thank you for this." He picked a spot in the carpet and stared straight down and smiled.
Not long ago, I was working on a show on the changing nature of relationships between men and women in the 90s. And Barbara and I had more than a few conversations about this. And I remember my last conversation on that show, we were sitting in her dressing room, and it was the final briefing. And she had quizzed me to death on this. And she finally threw her hands up in the air and with that characteristic expression of hers said, "I just don't get it. Why can't men and women get it together today?"
You have to understand that when you're doing a face-to-face interview, you need tons of equipment. You need tripods, you need lights, you need sound equipment. Anyway, Barbara and I were going down to Georgia to interview President Jimmy Carter. And we just arrived at Atlanta Airport, and all the luggage was coming down the carousel. And there's just tons of stuff all around us. This porter came rushing up, looked at all the equipment, looked at Barbara, and said, "Hey, lady, is this your rock band?" I thought it made Barbara's day.
We would never eliminate the Department of Indian Affairs tomorrow if we wanted to.
but steps have to be taken for those groups who are prepared to strike out on their own and who have the resources to do it.
What percentage is that?
Not very many.
That's tragic. What percentage?
If it sometimes seems to you that the world is moving a lot more quickly than it used to, you're not alone. These days, there's more competition, a lot more financial pressure, and on top of that, we demand more out of life than our parents did.
The probing eye of the TV camera seems to be everywhere, from the House of Commons and political conventions to classrooms, even some operating rooms. Videotape is always rolling.
For me, Barbara Frum was the most marvelous role model. In my generation, there weren't many female journalists on radio or TV. And suddenly, here was this really first-class interviewer called Barbara Frum. She made people like me sit up and say, she's done it, and I'm going to try.
We might as well, you know what we might as well do? We might as well get the Doug Grant clip queued up, too. Yeah.
Which one?
The Bob Ray interview.
Yeah, but she was really firm.
That's what I mean.
Yeah. Seeing 10 years ago.
Barbara was like a second mother to a lot of the people she worked with. I don't know where she got the time and energy to care about so many of us. I had once left the Journal for another job. I was very unhappy. I didn't even know how unhappy I was. I wrote a letter to Barbara because I missed her. I thought it was fairly positive, but I guess not, because a few days later I got a phone call. Someone picked up the phone and said, "Oh, it's Barbara Frum calling." They were really impressed. I got on the phone and Barbara said, "You're not happy, are you?" She caught me. She said, "Come back." I was back within 6 weeks. People always ask me, "What's Barbara like? What's Barbara like?" She was about the finest person you could ever know.
We were working on the 10th anniversary show, and when the crew had finished setting up the cameras and everything in the office that we were going to be shooting it in, I went to get Barbara, who was in the coffee room, which was about 50 feet away from the office we were planning to shoot her segment in. And it took us 40 minutes to make that 50 feet because she kept stopping and talking with anyone that she could talk with. And I finally said to her, "Barbara, are you avoiding this? Why are you going through treating this like a dental appointment?" And she said, "Well, in fact, I'm really scared. I'm really nervous." And I said, "How can you be nervous? You've been in front of a camera for 10 years. This is what you do for a living every day." And she said, "Yes, but when I do interviews, I focus on the other person, and that's what's important. But here, I have to talk about myself, and that really scares me."
Those producers have booked thousands of interviews for me over the last decade, and yet the one I'm invariably asked about first is my encounter with Margaret Thatcher. Knowing what a stickler for detail she is and how she loves to skewer journalists on the smallest mistake in facts, I was determined she wouldn't skewer me. Not possible.
I want to ask you so many things. I want to hear what you think about public works, but I know we're under time pressures, and I'm going to not ask you about what about public works. I'd rather ask you.
Well, no, I mean,
no, I want to ask so many things.
You can't just raise it and then leave it. We have a certain...
I'd actually prepped myself for Margaret Thatcher by watching what she did to another British journalist, and I knew how she loved to bully. I thought she couldn't bully me because I didn't have any ego on the line, but she bullies anyway. She just loves to project that hard-baked and lacquered facade. Not like Jonathan Miller, a man who loves to let his vulnerability show. What I learned about this man of 1,000 talents is that there's one missing. He can't read music.
There are producers, as there indeed there are conductors, who even during rehearsals have their heads immersed in the score, and every now and then look up at this rather irrelevant, vulgar thing going on the stage. Well, fortunately, I can close the score, say, I can't read that. Right, now what's going on here? And I can pay attention to the action.
I guess I'd worshipped Jonathan Miller ever since his Beyond the Fringe days, but in the hour or so that I had him in the green room before we went on camera, I suddenly realized this was a deeply depressive man who expressed so much joy and so much joy for life because he was really trying to get by all this depression. And when he started to act for me, I think my just basic infatuation with the richness of his soul just came through. I tried to control my feelings, but in that interview, as you saw, I kind of let go. Then there was Dr. Jamie Astafan, the man at the center of the Ben Johnson affair, that scandal that rocked Canada.
Has he ever asked you
directly, point blank, Dr. Astafan, did you ever give me anabolic steroids?
No.
Did you ever give me stanozolol? He's never asked you point blank. And if he did, if I ask now for him...
If I gave him stanozolol, the answer is no, he never did. Never have and never will.
Did you give him ever any anabolic steroids? Ever? Ever?
Not bad. No, he doesn't need it.
Would you testify under oath to that effect?
Yes.
In any court, at any federal inquiry?
Sure would.
For our viewers, that was one of the most dramatic interviews we ever broadcast, and certainly for me, because Jamie Astafan only agreed to come in at the last minute. He swept into the studio literally moments before air, and there was this prosecuting attorney, Barbara Frum, ready to say, are you guilty or are you not, expecting him to confess on air, and of course, he didn't do it, but he, I suppose with his body language and what he said, told it all. And then finally, our encounter with Nelson Mandela. A gorgeous new White House had been built for Nelson Mandela's return by Winnie Mandela, and yet he insisted on meeting the journalists of the world in the backyard of his humble bungalow from where it all started.
When we began, you talked about the political support you got throughout these 27 years. I want to know what sustained you as a man, as a human being. What beliefs, what ideals?
Well, it is not so much beliefs as the support which we got from our people locally and from friends abroad. That support which we got, the encouragement, and the fact that people have not forgotten about us, and that the struggle is going on in the country. Young people, you know, have taken up these issues. It made us feel that our lives were not wasted.
What the whole world wanted to know, of course, in those first hours after Nelson Mandela was released was, would this man be broken by prison? And of course, for many of the years of the 27 he was in, he was under extraordinary conditions. But this man emerged with enormous discipline, but above all with enormous dignity. And he touched everyone who met him that first day.
I walked around the newsroom today passing image after image of Barbara on all of those screens and thinking, what an enormous talent. Anyone who does an interview in this country has to measure it against the standard that she set, her intelligence, her clarity, and her absolute refusal to accept a snow job from anybody. Barbara Frum stood up for Canadians against the eternal snow job. I think that's how I'll remember her.
I remember the first time I met Barbara. I was a new producer on the show, and I was in awe of her. And I was going over to her dressing room to tell her that there was a new Sesame Street puppet. It was a Barbara Plum puppet, and I didn't know how she'd take this. I was pretty nervous. So I got to her dressing room, and she put me at ease immediately. It was the first time I'd met her. She told me she was tickled pink. She was thrilled about the puppet.
The Notebook with Barbara Plum.
Good morning, I'm Barbara Plum. Today, a special report on the word hot.
And the puppet was wearing small bifocals, the way Barbara wore small bifocals to read her notes off camera. And when the camera found Barbara after the segment, there she was wearing the small bifocals. So I think although Barbara took her work absolutely seriously, she didn't take herself too seriously.
For the Notebook, I'm Barbara Plum. Good night.
I was a cameraman here at the Journal up until 7 years ago when an accident left me paralyzed. Since then, Barbara always kept in touch. One of those times, I was at the Civic Hospital when the phone rang and rang. I was unable to answer it. Just to show you Barbara's tenacity, she phoned the nursing station and arranged for someone to come down to the room and handle the phone call for me. At the end of our conversation, she also thanked the nurse. And the nurse sort of hung up the phone and looked at me and said, the voice sounded familiar. And I said, it was Barbara Frum. She said, I just spoke to Barbara Frum. She said, wait till I tell the others. And I think after that phone call, I received a lot better care.
Earlier this year, quite a visibly distraught Barbara came into my office one day. There was a breaking news story that we hadn't been covering very much, and Barbara felt that we should be. She had been quite aggressive in her feelings about how we should have been covering this. And she was now worried that people would think that she was arrogant, perhaps, that she was trying to influence the editorial direction of the program, that people would just find her too pushy. This touched something really deep in Barbara. She hated to think that people would think that of her. And she said to me, all of my life, all I've tried to do is be a good person. And that, for me, summed up Barbara Frum. It's a very simple epitaph for a very complex woman. Barbara Frum was a good person.
My memory of the period that I got to know Barbara quite well began when my wife was diagnosed with terminal cancer. I got a call at home one day from Barbara. Said, "I'm Barbara Frum. I hear that Ingrid has cancer." She said, "What can I do? Can I help in any way?" She got very involved in practical things like who was her doctor, and she said, "I'll check him out to see whether he's a good specialist. I'll check him out with my mother's doctor." She said, "Be very careful about what kind of food she eats. Find out what her comfort food is." One day I heard through an intermediary that Barbara had committed herself to do a speaking engagement, and she wanted to donate to us the fee that she was going to get for this so that we could take a holiday. When I thanked her for this, she said, "Well, you know, a friend went through this and found that the holiday really kind of helped her a lot." And the story of Barbara's generosity to us became pretty much a legend through the village we live in. And this morning, I heard the news, not from radio, but from friends and neighbors who called to say that they were personally really upset that this had happened.
For some reason, I knew Barbara Frum more as a person than I would have as just a producer. We were up the street about 5 years ago, both having a cup of coffee. She had a frothy bowl of cappuccino, and it was at that point that she told me that she was sick, and that at one point this train was going to take off from a station and she wasn't going to be ready for it. I didn't know quite what to say, and I asked her, "So how do you get by every day with that uncertainty?" She looked down at her cappuccino, she took a sip, she put it down, and she said, "Boy, that's a good cup of coffee. Every cup of coffee is a good one for me."
If we had to isolate a virtue, then it's an ancient one: loyalty. Barbara gave it generously and earned it back from all who worked with her. And as a journalist, her virtue is another ancient one: honor. You might think, because she could be tough on the air, that she was always totally poised and certain about what to do. But really, that's not the nature of a great journalist. She anguished about every word. We sat around this desk, measured the impact of a headline, debated the direction of an interview, the weight of an adjective. Is it right? Is it fair? She was terrified of getting it wrong, consumed with absolute precision, always asking advice from everyone here. She knew television can be dangerous in its power. It can destroy a reputation, shake a financial market, stir a tide of emotion. I think she is the most moral and honorable journalist I have ever met. There are lots of very talented, dedicated, and hard-working people here, and in our bureaus and documentary units scattered across the country tonight. And we will honor Barbara Frum by carrying forward tomorrow, and in the years to come, the Journal. This institution she was so central in building. We'll do it by trying to live up to her standard, her dedication, and to her conviction that to sit in that studio and to sit at these desks is a national trust, accountable only to the people of the country which she loved so much. Good night, dear friend. Well done.